She is great at promoting what it's like to be a woman in IT. Without further ado, I'm hoping you will enjoy Anna's talk, talking all things functional.
Hey everyone, my name is Anna. I work as engineer manager in a company called CashUp. I hope everybody had an awesome lunch break, and I really hope that you're not gonna fall asleep during my talk. But before I start, I would like to make a short quiz of the audience. And we're gonna use a very sophisticated technology today called show of hands. So I hope every one of you have at least one hand that they're capable of raising. So let's do a test drive. I ask everyone in the audience to raise at least one hand. Come on. Oh, awesome. Almost 100% successful run on staging is completed. So, my first question. Raise your hand if you ever heard about functional programming before. Oh, wow, okay, half of the audience. Keep your hand raised if you know what monad is. Oh, seriously? Oh, come on. Okay. Next question. Raise your hands if you ever heard about Scala or used that before. Okay, half of the audience, nice. And keep your hand raised if you're still using Scala for work or your side projects. Oh, not so popular in Melbourne anymore, okay. Last question. That's a tricky one. Raise your hand if you ever heard about category theory before. Oh, wow, more people than using Scala. Okay. Keep your hand raised if you understand it. What? 2, 3? Okay. Thanks a lot for taking part in this test. I identified 3 experts in this audience. And at the end of my talk, like I know you people, I will refer all the complicated questions to you guys. So for me personally, my introduction to functional programming started back in 2015 BC, before COVID, when I was working in a company called realestate.com.au. Yay, I hope some of you heard about this company. Yes, few people. But I hope the rest of you Melbournians use their websites or application, I don't know, to look at the rich people houses on a Friday afternoon or to find a place for rent. But yeah, back in those days, in 2015, my introduction to functional programming was not an easy one because it wasn't based on a free will. It just happened that after numerous restrictions in realestate.com.au, I ended up in a new team, and I was told that on level 4, we don't do Ruby anymore, and I need to learn Scala. Back then, most of our production systems were written in Ruby and Rails, and we had Java as a backend. And the company decided to embark on a big journey to replace all of those legacy systems with React and Scala. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll take part in this journey. I don't have many other options. Well, there was always an option to undust my resume and to lie at the interviews. But I was too lazy. So I did what any lazy person would do and decided to learn Scala. Luckily for me, I got surrounded by amazing people, basically to hold my hand as I'm entering into this functional programming rabbit hole. Chris Myers and Ken Scambler, I hope some of those names ring a bell in this audience, because they are the real gurus of Melbourne functional programming community. And if you don't know who they are, please go on Google and find the talks on YouTube, because they're great. And I still remember my first lesson with Chris Myers. And he said, let me introduce you to the language that doesn't have exceptions. And I was like, what? Doesn't have exceptions? I mean, is it even possible for language to not have exceptions? I mean, exceptions are the necessarily evil that exist in the real world when our perfectly written instructions needs to do something useful, like, I don't know, connect to database or read the file. And I thought, well, if this language doesn't have exceptions, it means that the programs that are written in this language doesn't have exceptions. It means that developers know exactly what's happening, and more importantly, what's going to happen. So developers are like gods. Like everything that we write is a laws of nature. And I know for sure that developers are not gods. I mean, sometimes we think like we are, or we behave like we are, but we're not omnipowerful and definitely not omnismart. Then, Chris Myers confused me even more. He said that Scala doesn't have a concept of null. And I was like, what? No null and no exception? Does it mean no null reference exceptions? Like before Ruby, I was programming in C#, and null reference exceptions is the only thing that I still remember from those days. I will never forget null reference exceptions because they like cockroaches. The moment that you think you killed the last one of them, 100 more appear out of nowhere. So for me, it was impossible to imagine the language without exceptions and without nulls, and definitely without null reference exceptions. And I was kind of right, because Chris introduced us to the concept of none. And I was like, okay, is it none and null is the same thing? And he's like, no, 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 you don't understand. Null is nothing, but none is the type that represents the absence of the value, most likely used in another type called option. So in some languages, like C# or Ruby or many, many other languages, let's say you have a type of integer. That can be integer, it have a value, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Or null, shit happens. In Scala, there is also a type of integer, but it can only be integer. And if there is a tiny, tiny little chance in your code that this variable will not have a value, you can't use the type of integer. You have to use option over integer and have either the value or none. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. It's kind of the same thing, but you just use those extra types. So instead of just using normal integer, I have to use the option over integer. That's okay. I mean, it doesn't sound too complicated. I think I can learn this functional programming thing. I mean, I have a technical degree, so hopefully it won't be too bad. And then I thought, well, if null exists, but just called differently with all of those extra wrappers, maybe exceptions exist as well. And I was correct, because Chris introduced us to the type of either. And either, in a nutshell, it's something or something else. And that something else is, in most cases, is an error. I thought, oh, okay, so it's the same thing. It just, you need to be more explicit, I guess, in the area of your code where exceptions will occur. So, breath out, developers are not gods. The natural order of things is restored. It's just those extra types and extra wrappers. I can learn it. I mean, I have a technical degree, so it doesn't sound too complicated. Then, going further into the rabbit hole, I learned another fancy functions like fold, reduce, compose, map, flat map, fold left, fold right. And the fancy fact that you can chain all of them together in one line because those functions are some kind of magical entities that called monads. And you can use like the output of the right one is the input of your left one, or the input of your left one is the output of your right one. I mean, for me, it was very confusing. I didn't understand why we need such complexity and why anyone would want to write, I don't know, like 20 functions in one line of code. It would be impossible to read it. But I thought, it's OK. Maybe if I learn those functions individually, I will eventually be able to chain them together and hopefully write something useful. That's OK. I thought, I can learn it. It will be a hard time, but I can do it. But then things got even worse, because I got introduced to Scala syntax. As I can describe this, someone decided to utilize all the weird symbols on a keyboard in every possible combination. Like, seriously, look at Scala Z. This is language written by aliens. They did it on purpose so humans can read it. There is no words. I mean, why would you even call it a language? It's just kind of like equal symbols, brackets, slashes, underscore. Like, I realized at the end of my first lesson that I'm embarking on a journey to learn a language that have those confusing types, very weird functions called monads, and syntax that's impossible to Google. And it's true, the first base that I've ever seen written in Scala basically looked to me like that. It's a bunch of Egyptian hieroglyphs stuck on top of each other. I mean, how I was supposed to understand that? The only words are there is basically the name of the variables, thanks to my developers. Luckily, I had a Rosetta Stone, Chris Myers, but we were not in British Museum, so I couldn't spend 24 years pairing with Chris to try to understand how to work with that. So I needed a strategy. And my strategy at the beginning was very simple. Given a problem, I was trying to write some code. Well, kind of idiomatically, it was probably kind of in Ruby or in C#, very objective-oriented, in Scala syntax, obviously, to the best of my knowledge. Then I would bring it to Chris. And I would smile and ask him to make it functional. He would apply his magic and give me like a perfect one line of code that have all of those fancy functions. And I would copy-paste in my code base and admire it. I would admire it because I was not able to read it or to understand it. So for me, Chris's magic was some kind of a super-duper hash algorithm that you can give like a human-readable input. It's doing its stuff, and it gives you something that you can never decrypt it back. Well, to be fair, as a developer, like, do I really need to decrypt it back? Do I really need to read and understand my code? Maybe no. Hopefully, there are other people in my company who are able to deal with that stuff. So this worked for me for a while, until Chris decided to introduce interpreter pattern in our code base. Raise your hand if you ever heard about interpreter pattern. No one? Seriously? You lucky bastards. You joined the functional programming in the age of roses and unicorns, because you didn't have to deal with that stuff. It was like the bottom of my understanding. Like, I could not make any code changes to this code base with this interpreter pattern. And I thought, this is it. I reached the bottom. I can't learn any further. And I'm going to die crying in this team. But then things got even worse, because we start using Argonaut. Hands up who know what Argonaut is? Okay, very unlucky few. But the rest of you, again, the lucky bastards. Because manipulating JSON document with Argonaut library was like the most painful experience in my career as a software engineer. Like, this library is made by devil in hell to drive normal people crazy. Like, the rest of you probably heard about cats and Circe and maybe used some lenses, and like, luckily you escaped the hellishness of Argonaut. And even in realestate.com.au, we stopped using it after a few years, which is great. So, I guess at this point of my talk, you're probably thinking that my first year learning Scala was very painful. And it's true. I was mostly bleeding, sweating, and crying. But I was learning. And I embarked on a journey to learn a new language, a new concept, a new mindset. So that was okay. But the thing that annoyed me the most was that my colleagues were very happy and enthusiastic about learning Scala. I even started to hear phrases from them like, "Oh, this Ruby code makes my eyes bleed." Like, all of a sudden, they got bitten by the functional programming vampire, and they started to hate garlic, even though yesterday, they were eating it just fine. And like pandemic, Scala spread around REA. And the more people got bitten, the more people refused to go back to Ruby. And some devoted fanatics even decided to introduce Haskell to our production code bases. Like Haskell, while no one was watching. At that time, I realized this is it. The line is crossed. The genie is out of the bottle. We went above and beyond the event horizon, and I can never, ever be able to go back to Ruby. But I thought, it's okay. I think by that time, I learned a little bit of Scala. Well, at least I could see the difference between map and flat map, which was great. And someone decided that apparently I'm now good enough to teach new people Scala, which was even more frustrating experience because I had some intuition, like I could write some code that was kind of functional and kind of working, but I could not explain what I was doing and why. So if there are people in the audience who paired with me during those times, I apologizing profusely and ask for your forgiveness. And I think then back in 2018, again, BC, before COVID, there was another interesting thing that happened in our community. Everybody started to be obsessed about the mathematics. I was like, whoa, well, wait a minute. So learning functional programming and writing Scala code is not cool anymore? Now everybody talks about algebra and category theory, so I need to know how to bake a pie in order to hang out with cool kids? Well, how to bake a pie is the reference on a book written by mathematician Eugenia Chang. She's a very famous mathematician, and I hope I encourage you to read her books because she can explain category theory in a human language to another human, which is great. But I was thinking, we work in a company that advertises properties. I mean, we're not looking for Higgs boson or predicting weather. Why I need to learn so much mathematics? So to everyone in the FP community who know anything about the category theory, please keep it to yourself. Like, seriously, keep this bar low. Let's keep this genie in a bottle. We need new people to join our functional programming community. And it's actually become very easy, like, to identify functional programming developers in the crowd, not because they are wearing fancy t-shirts. I mean, everybody wears fancy t-shirts, but because they use fancy words like monads or covariant. So you can make an experiment during the break. If you go outside and if you see the person, and if you don't know if he or she is a functional programming developer, you can come closely and say something like, psst, psst, monad. And if they answer you something like, free monad, congratulations, you just conducted a secret handshake, and now you identified another person in the secret community. I mean, another way how you identify functional programming developers is that they might seem a little bit arrogant, well, especially at the functional programming conferences. But to be fair, if I will be able to understand the concept of free monads, or at least to explain it in human language to another human, I would probably declare myself a guru, and I would sit in the ivory tower till the rest of my career. But we are not in the promised land yet. Not everyone is converted. There is still a lot of people, even in this audience, who haven't seen the light of the functional programming. So there's still a lot of room for introductory talk like this one and preaching. Like, I personally like a talk by Ken Scambler, you can find it on YouTube, when he tries to explain the functional programming concept to object-oriented developers using Java. And he gives like a great examples. So normal functions, like if you write it in a simple Java syntax, not in a functional programming way, like connect to database or read the file, they can connect to database or read the file. Or they can connect to Skynet and take over the world. You don't know, because there are a lot of side effects that you haven't accounted for. But if you write it in a functional programming way and try to account for all of those side effects, most likely they will just connect to database or return you an error, which is awesome. You know, our world is very complicated as it is, so we don't need crazy functions running around and trying to connect to Skynet. And for those who already learned the basics, obviously there is mathematics. But as I said, keep it to yourself. For me personally, when I left realestate.com.au in 2019, just when the COVID started, I haven't seen much Scala or Haskell in other companies. Thanks God. But I noticed that when I came back to those object-oriented languages and to Kotlin, to C# or to Ruby, I started thinking as a functional programming. I was like, no, that's a lot of side effects, or there's just a lot of mutability, or null reference exceptions. Gosh, don't remember those. And I started to see those concepts creeping up in other languages. Like the functions like map, reduce appeared in C#, and there are functional programming libraries like Arrow for Kotlin, which was great. So I was like, cool. So if I ever want to come back to the magical world of my rabbit hole, I can use those. So I personally think that it's important for developers to know the concepts, maybe not necessarily learn Scala or Haskell, but there are Rust and there's Clojure, like something, I don't remember, like there's so many languages now, and hopefully some of them are actually Googleable. So now in 2023, all of the people who didn't put their hand up when I asked the question about functional programming, you have no excuses. Like all of those who put their hand up, go and buy those ones. Like encourage them to explore that, because there are so many benefits. Like I personally believe we need to teach the functional programming concept in universities and in workshops. So developers can have multiple tools, and they should think about the side effects and immutability. And hopefully, unlike me, they don't need to go through the 9 circles of hell to understand something. Well, hopefully 2 or 3, but not more than that. Well, this is it that I prepared for you for today. Thanks a lot for listening. I'm very keen on your feedback, so please deliver the good one to me and constructive one to Chris Myers.
First, I want to say it was really interesting presentation. We learned a lot, even though we work with Scala. Question, if you have to come back to that learning process, what would you do differently this time, as you know it?
Well, I would probably, I don't know, try to lock Chris Myers in cage and making sure that he would never introduce interpreter pattern in any of the code bases. But I think those days were a bit different. Like, we didn't have many resources. There was a couple of books, and as I said, the syntax was impossible to Google, and a Stack Overflow wasn't much help. So we had to, and luckily for us, it was the before COVID times, so we could come and talk to people. I think now, I guess if I would have to start learning Scala now, I would probably also start with Scala, because for me personally, it's a bit better than Haskell. And I would probably I would do a lot of learning by myself first before I was released in a while and, pair with people. Because when you start pairing with someone who is very, very knowledgeable and you don't know even basics, you had just got very confused. And definitely start with some libraries or some simple concept that you can Google. And I know that there are lots of courses on Coursera, LinkedIn, and different learning that do introductory to Scala. So definitely do one of those.
Hi. I just wanted to know, what would you suggest if you wanted to introduce somebody completely brand new, even possibly to programming, like a career switcher, into functional programming? How would you do that without terrifying them?
Good question. I would say don't introduce them to functional programming concept at all. Start with object-oriented languages. I mean, when I was working at MIOB, we were sponsoring the program, Develop Her, when we were introducing basically career switchers to the programming. And they were using the RMIT courses, and when we look at them, I asked them, oh, why are you doing it in Java? And they said, well, Java is a very simple language, and it's very easy to start with a person who knows zero programming, explaining them a very basic concept, so they can quickly write something that's actually working. Like, if you're starting with Haskell or some language like Scala, it will take a while for the person to write something that's actually working. So it can lead to a lot of frustrations and misunderstanding, and it can deter them from programming altogether, especially if they're going to be pairing with the person who will keep blabbing about monads and covariance and all of that stuff. You'll be like, oh, that's too complicated. So I would say start with simple, like Java, start with a very simple concept. And then maybe when you already understand side effects a little bit, like when you connect it to a database, when you read the file, when you interact it with different APIs, then you can start introducing this concept in the language that they already know. So it will be easy for them. And then when they're going to switch, let's say, to the functional programming language, they'll be like, oh, yeah, I understand. This is because we want to make things immutable, or we don't want to have those side effects. Or, definitely don't give them the definition of monad. That's the most frustrating thing that you can do for a newbie. Just call them, it's just a function, it do stuff, You will learn later.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I found it really funny. I have a question about the organizational context. After you introduced functional programming and RAA, what were the positive impacts you saw on the engineering or the business in total?
Very good question. Well, I guess the first positive impact that developers become very busy learning new things, so they stop bothering other business people with stupid questions. But I think the journey wasn't easy because, as I said, it took a long time even for experienced developer to feel useful or productive in new language. But I think after we got to the critical point, after we got through the threshold when the critical mass of people learned enough, we was able to build more frameworks to support newbies to join. We started the Functional Programming Guild. We encouraged basically people who at the different stages at their journey to present the talks, to share their experience, to pair with each other. like business people probably would say that everything became much longer. So that was probably one of our complaints from delivery leads, like, oh, those teams who do stuff in Scala, like it takes them like 3 months more to deliver something useful than the ones who were using Ruby. And that was kind of a little bit false impression, because I noticed that even though it took longer, but actually we spent way less time on supporting it, because guess what? We didn't have to deal with null reference exceptions. And I noticed that definitely our like operational support and the time that we spent on diagnosing and having the issues was way less. And we also started to have way less issues. So it felt like a very good long-term investment for the company itself, especially when you're building a system that requires a lot of traffic and very complex. Like, I think some folks here at REA can share their own war stories, and I heard recently that unfortunately the functional programming community is not as thriving in REA if it was like back in 2018 or 19. And I think for the company it was also like an interesting thing to think, how would you hire people from outside? Like, there's not that many Scala developers running around. So most of the people you will probably have to teach. And if you don't have those network and those framework in place for newbies to quickly get up to speed and to feel useful and productive, that they actually earn their salary, like it will be very complicated. So that's, again, that's my personal opinion. Please, people from REA, don't quote me on this.
Just wondering if your Twitter handle is a reference to your journey with Scala.
Good question. That is actually a reference to my book. Like, when I was very frustrating on my learning path in the Scala programming, I decided to write a book. It's called Survival Guide for Women in IT. It doesn't reference my journey about Scala, but it's mostly about the women surviving in IT community. So the book is available on Kindle only. So feel free to go to Amazon, download it, and give me very constructive feedback, but please don't do it in the public comments. Like, use the Twitter handle and only post the good reviews on Amazon, you know? Like, it's important. Like, those algorithms prefer the 5-star ratings.
You know, I'm an object-oriented Ruby developer, and I'm just wondering, how do you tie, like, real-world, like, problems and business-driven design, like real-world business problems, and domain-driven design with the functional programming? Wouldn't it be kind of easy to do it in object when you have, like, you know, a real object, cup of coffee, replace it with another cup rather than just refilling it, yeah.
Yeah, very good question. That was exactly my thinking when I was learning functional programming. Like, why we need so much complexity? Like, can I just, well, luckily Scala is actually have a concept of objects or structures that it's not necessarily means that everything is a function and there is no concept of, you know, objects, and there is always like certain inheritance happening in those objects. I think the real world problem you faced when, let's say, you deal with a very big systems that have a lot of traffic, and like obviously in a situation when you can't log everything, and when error occurs, it can have a very bad side effects down the stream. So I guess something like if you think about big data stores or databases, and you need to create some kind of like feeders who will feed these data stores, and some kind of services that then will be able to quickly get information from there and pass it on to another services. Like, using functional programming in Scala is definitely make them more reliable, I would say. And luckily, like, you would still have to deal with certain object complexity, like you said, a cup of coffee or maybe refill it, but I saw that the architecture for big systems started to slowly drift from stateful architectures to something that people call stateless architectures or event-driven architectures. And I've personally seen the success of using functional programming for those. But back to your question, like, very difficult to convince people. I mean, go through 9 circles of hell, and then go back to Ruby, and then I was like, oh no, that thing was actually a bit better for the specific problem that I'm trying to solve. But yeah, it will take some time.